Hi, I'm Akbar, developer advocate at Figma, and this is Bridging the Gap, where we talk about how to improve the collaboration between designers and developers. And today I'm here with Mal.
Hey, I am a designer advocate. We're on the same team, which is pretty awesome. But I've been at Figma for a little over 2.5 years now. I have a background in design, product design, graphic design, brand design. So, kind of a variety of things, but which has kind of led me into more of a, you know, job in designer advocacy, which I really enjoy.
And something we've talked about a lot is that the process between designers and developers, there's a lot of chaos.
Oh,
You
yeah.
know? We're like always trying to figure out how do we manage that? What what's something that you've seen that's helped a lot?
Okay. I think well, it's interesting because like I do appreciate a lot of the chaos. I think like it's never going to completely disappear. And I think like there's time for chaos, but to help kind of like remedy some of the unwanted chaos that happens. I mean, obviously, communication is probably the most important thing, but like how you go about that communication is going to really be the driving force between like what makes a difference in your process. So, yeah, I think upfront communication is probably what I found to be the most successful and like trying to get ahead of that and trying to plan when, the team comes together, when we diverge and kind of go and explore. And yeah, I would say like that's probably I could get more into it, but that's probably what I would say like is the starting point for me.
Yeah, well, when we're
Yeah.
talking about communication, one thing that comes up often is you don't always get to have full on communication with your team when you're working on a large project. Like, have you ever been in a situation where after you've shared your design with somebody, that's like the last time you've spoken to them?
Oh, yeah. That's actually been probably a lot of my experience. My background, I was more working in like an agency environment. So my design team was more consulting, and we would send off our designs and not really know exactly where they would end up. I had no idea like where those files went. If sometimes I didn't even know they made it to production. So that's definitely something that caused friction and like hope that like I didn't know if my designs actually made it anywhere.
Yeah.
But when I did, work on smaller in-house teams, um, I worked with, freelance developers or just like freelance writers from a distance, and we would have sync meetings every now and then,
Yeah.
but they weren't permanently on our team sometimes. So it was a little bit more difficult to be on the same page for
Yeah.
sure.
I think that
Yeah.
makes sense. And then what, like what we've been talking about communication, like what does that look like in an asynchronous environment? So, like, sometimes you would get together and you'd have a conversation about what you're working on, but what does that look like when you're not physically next to each other or talking to each other?
Right. I think like every team is different. And there's also like a variety of things that you can do. In my case, I think it also depends on the time zones as well and just like the different methods. So, tooling can make a huge difference. I think like if you can at least start your kind of method of work beginning, even if you especially if you know you're gonna be async,
Uh-huh.
if you can try and get on the same page of like, how are we going to give each other feedback? What tools are we going to use? What types of feedback do you like to receive, and when do you like to receive that? I think is like one important step. And then other than that, I've tried pretty much everything. I've tried like recording videos to walk through, my intent or like my ideas. I've left like sticky notes. I've left full docs. Sent
Yeah.
messages, like text messages, like everything. So I think, yeah, it's always depending on the team,
Yeah.
but that's something I'd like to try and get ahead of upfront. What about you? Like, what have you found to be successful?
I think a lot of what you have been talking about, like async videos, news, etc. As somebody who's relatively comfortable in Figma and working in really closely with designers,
Yeah.
one thing that I've found really helpful is being able to have that async communication in Figma. So
Right.
either through comments, being able to have like a back and forth discussion, or when they call things out using annotations, it's really helpful for me to be able to just kind of at a glance understand what is this design doing and how do I get the information that I need.
Right, right. Yeah. I feel like annotations is something that I've been doing for a while, but like probably didn't put a name to it.
Yeah.
I guess like how would you describe an annotation in the design dev environment?
Yeah. I mean, at its core, like to me, an annotation is just a note,
Mm,
right? Um, it's a note that will point me to something that's directly related to the design that tells me how it works, maybe very specific properties about like what this thing is, how
right.
big is it, what style it's using, etc. All that stuff that just makes it really easy for me at a glance to figure out, okay, I'm looking at a button. This button's coming from this library. It's a component that already exists. It might be using a specific font type. It might be have like a specific size and dimensions like attached to it. And that's like all well and good because it makes it really easy for me to scan things and get those properties. But the things that are the most helpful to me are when it's telling me something about the design that
Mhm.
doesn't exist on the screen.
Right.
So like understanding like if I click on this button, it's gonna take me to this flow. Or if I outside of a button example, like if I run this action in our design, it creates a loading state that I might not see on the screen, but something that I know like is a common pattern that between us. And just seeing a note like that is something that's really helpful to me to be able to just kind of orient myself.
I definitely think that's something I can relate to. I've definitely struggled to like m- with the idea that I'm giving my designs over to somebody and you know whatever they're looking at, they're going to make their best guess.
Yeah.
And it's really helpful to have something to be able to give a little bit more context,
Yeah.
especially because I feel like designers in their minds, they're always thinking, but like sometimes they don't like articulate exactly what's going in their mind. They're just like, oh, they'll get it. But it's more helpful to be a lot more prescriptive about what exactly is going on. I also think though that like annotations are probably, especially in Figma, are really exciting because it can be seen as a very tedious process for designers. Um, so what I'm really excited about is the ability to just have a more streamlined approach to it. Like it's just more efficient rather than other ways that I've tried to like standardize a process for that type of communication.
Yeah.
But yeah, I definitely have run into many situations where I feel like I probably should have annotated more or I was trying to find ways to do it better.
hmm
Hmm.
And I think there's something to be said about like even knowing what you need to annotate in the first place.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right? Like you can tell me a lot of stuff, maybe from the designer perspective, but it feels like we need to have a conversation about like, oh, what's really important for me to be able to see in the annotation when I'm consuming them.
Yeah, that is something I really would love to know at every project, but like especially from your perspective, because I definitely struggle with feeling like I'm gonna overwhelm someone if I like go in and try and annotate or spell everything out. Like I don't want to almost be annoying with what I hand over,
Yeah.
but I also want to like make sure I have enough detail in there as like a considerate teammate. So, yeah, I am curious like I guess what type of fidelity or how much annotating do you think is necessary and do you feel like it differs from project to project?
Yeah. It definitely differs from project to project. I think it also differs from team to team.
Okay.
So like one thing I mentioned before is like I'm fairly comfortable in Figma.
Yeah.
And so like I don't need to see a lot of annotations about very specific specs or like I don't need to be overly inundated with that when I can like inspect it myself. What's helpful to me is when you're calling out behavior, implementation notes, things about the flow, things that I can't see on the canvas. But then also it's really helpful to make sure that I don't miss a detail. So if something's like really subtle
Yeah.
that I might not notice just by looking at the design, that's a really helpful annotation for me. Like, oh, like I didn't notice that this gap was a little bit smaller than what our normal gap is.
Mm.
Do you want to take a look at a file and maybe we can
Yeah,
talk
yeah,
through it?
let's take a look. I think I have some designs ready. We can brainstorm a bit about what this could look like.
Yeah. So over here we're in dev mode. Um, and for those of you that don't know, dev mode is what happens when you see this developer view. As a designer, it's important to go into dev mode so that you can set these annotations in the first place.
Right.
And this is what's going to be visible to your engineers. And I'll go ahead and create a new annotation. And one thing that I can do is, let's say I want to put it on this image over here,
Uh-huh.
and I can show some properties like we were talking about, like the height, the width,
Right.
properties on the actual layer. But what I can also do is just leave a note that just tells me something about this annotation. And for this purpose, I'm just kind of going to say clicking on this will open a PDP page. Whoop. A PDP page.
Right.
And this kind of just tells me like what the behavior of this thing is going to be. And now you can see that this annotation is over here.
Ah, okay. So it's like stuck to the object, and that is kind of how it shows context to what you're referring to in the annotation. I noticed that like it surfaces properties, and that changes based on what you have selected on the canvas. So maybe if there's like a component, it's going to surface that component as
Yeah.
well. And does it show different variations too?
Yeah, so it'll show, you can have it select and show like which styles are being applied, etc. So like if we take a look at, I did that on the image, but why don't we do it on an annotation on the component? So I can go into the layers panel when it's a little bit hard to select something. I can go here and I think click on add annotation, and you'll notice that this is an instance.
Yes.
So I can click on property and I can put the component here. And
Oh,
so now
well, yeah.
when I go in here and as a developer and I'm looking at this, I can see what component it is. And that just makes it a little bit easier for me to find what I'm looking for.
Right, right. So thinking about like how it could be overwhelming if I went in and like annotated, say,
Yeah.
every component on here, like that's not going to be useful.
Yeah.
What's like a good example of when I would want to like call out a specific component? Would it be like if we're using a different variant, or yeah, I'm just curious what you think.
Yeah, I think what you mentioned about using a different variant is a really good point, especially when the differences are really subtle,
Mm-hmm.
right? So this is a great place for you to kind of call out, this is not the ordinary, like you might tag the component and then have like an actual note that says, this is not the ordinary component that we use.
Right.
In this case, we're using this variant. And that's something that's really helpful. But I think it also really depends on the team that you're working on. So like if I was less comfortable in Figma, I think I would really appreciate being a bit more you being a bit more prescriptive with the annotations, because then I don't have to like learn how to navigate so much, and I can focus on like, okay, these are the things that you're showing me, and these are the things that I need to care about, that are really helpful.
Right, right. What about like styles and variables? When like, do you find that that would be important to also call out, or is it like kind of similar to components where it's like basically how comfortable developers are in Figma?
I would definitely based on how comfortable they are in Figma, as well as just kind of like how baked into the process it is.
Yeah.
Like when we're working together, like if we're used to using components and used to using token names,
Right.
right, then that becomes a lot less helpful to be shown in an annotation, unless something is changing. Like maybe we're changing the annotation, or we're changing the component that's being used or the token that's being used. And that brings me to another good point of like one really great annotation that we can have is when a design is changing and you can like explicitly call that out
Right.
in the file. So like I don't need to go ahead and search for what's changed. You can like literally leave an annotation on it, and I know, okay, this is the thing that's changing in this design,
Mm-hmm.
and that's all I need to focus on.
So with annotations, with that specific use case, if you get rid of the annotation, then there's no like version history for it though, right?
Not for the annotation, but there is version history on the layers
On
themselves.
the layers themselves. So you could couple that with
Yeah.
that to just like,
Exactly.
yeah, I feel like that's a good addition, because I know that we do have that compare changes in that version history, but that is a completely different view. And the annotation is very, very contextualized and descriptive. Like you see it visually on the canvas. So I really like that suggestion of using annotations for
Yeah.
showing changes.
And I think we have an example here that shows like, are the examples that we showed are definitely just here to show how to use the tool.
Right.
But I think we have an example of what a good annotation might look like. So I'm going to zoom out over here, jump into here, and I see in this frame over here that we have these annotations that
Yes.
kind of talk about like all the things that I was talking about in terms of understanding an edge case. So over here, we know that if the device is larger than our max width value, which is over showing up as 480 pixels, you want to keep that logo centered. And again, this is not something that I would have seen just by looking at this design.
Yeah.
And so this is like really helpful for me, but like, oh, okay, I need to make sure that I'm not explicitly writing that hard coded and that I'm using the right margins so that our logo stays centered. Same thing with how we treat these images. We want to retain that aspect ratio at 1:1. And that's a good note for me to make sure that like, okay, when we're scaling these up and scaling these down, they're staying with the same aspect ratio.
Right. Well, I see there's also the measurement tool. I'm curious, like, your thoughts on when that is useful too. Like, I assume, and like from my perspective, it's probably more helpful when things are differ from what we normally use for spacing or padding. So is that kind of correct? Like, we also don't want to like we don't want to annotate everything. We probably aren't coming in here and adding measurements for every single element on the canvas. What situations have you found it helpful to kind of see those measurements?
Yeah. In this scenario, we're calling out very specific measurements that kind of set up some scale, as well as show this gap over here.
Right.
But I think one thing that might be even more helpful than like an explicit measurement, like we're showing over here, is being able to talk about custom measurements, right? Oftentimes when we're working in code, we're not hard coding these values. We're probably using some relative unit, like this thing is supposed to take up 50% of the screen, or maybe we're using a grid layout and might take up 2 columns or 6 columns of our grid layout. And so one thing that we can do now with measurements is I can take this measurement and I can annotate this image right here, and I can just pull this up all the way over here, and I'm gonna say that this is 50% of the screen.
Right.
And by doing that, now it's really easy for me to understand relatively that this is what I want to kind of set this unit to, instead of focusing on the hard-coded value of whatever this this image is showing me. Because things in Figma aren't always one-to-one with how it's going to represent in code.
Yeah.
And so this is something that's really helpful to kind of address that gap.
Right. I think this is like the perfect example of something that developers could explain to designers to make things more seamless.
Mhm.
That's probably something I'm not sure I would completely know when I'm, giving my files to my developer or just, calling things out. But it's just like another way to get closer to speaking the same language. So I really like that you called that out. And I think having that ability to add the custom text in there is going to be a game changer for when, especially since every team is different, you want to be able to customize your process and your annotations as much as possible.
Yeah, and I think that communication part is really key, right? Like it's only going to get better the more we talk. And you can't figure this out on your, really, no, it's like, it's not something that you do in isolation. Like we're working as partners on a team. So that's where it's really helpful to kind of have that chance to sink in. And like you said, tailor it to our own process, because that's going to change from team to team. I think we've had enough of the demo here, and I wanted to ask you one thing before we close out.
Okay.
So why don't we close this?
Sure.
And I'm really curious if you had like one tip that you wanted to share to developers when thinking about design, what would it be?
One tip to share to developers. Just don't be afraid to get in the room and voice your opinion, because it saves us a ton of time in the end. And I feel like there's no need to have a divide. We're starting to see already how more communication, more collaboration is just really a benefit to everybody. So I feel like, definitely voice your opinion, but like also be willing to share your knowledge. And know that like designers don't understand everything. They may not know certain things in the way that things like for functionality, how it is going to actually be implemented. So I think just being open
Yeah.
to sharing, but also in the same way as like be open to learning from designers as well. Like
Yeah.
I think yeah, my biggest tip is just be open and just like be willing to learn from each other because yeah, that's the way that things get done and
Yeah.
things get done well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's pretty helpful. I mean, even in our own experience of like whenever I'm working with you, like I think the biggest thing is just being able to like. I feel like I walk away learning something new about the design process every time we chat,
Yeah.
and so it helps me be a better partner to you.
Yeah.
But it also helps me like be a better engineer because like the more that I understand these things, the more impact that I can have when we're talking, and I can like save us both time ahead, in the beginning of a process,
Right.
and start being able to like kind of interpret some of the things that you're saying without you having to be overly prescriptive every
Yeah.
time, and you kind of build that with time.
Yeah, I think one last thing. It's just like don't assume the other person also knows what you're talking about because like there's certain times where you're saying things and I'm like, should I just nod or should I be stop you and be like, wait, can I really have no idea what you're saying? So I feel like that happens a lot on both sides. Just be aware that like something you're saying could be completely over the person's head at the moment. Um, and on your end, if you're not understanding something, like stop and say like, hey, there's no shame in not knowing something. That's how we grow and that's how we get better. So yeah, that's what I would say.
I think that's a pretty good tip.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us, Mal.
Yeah. Thanks.
This is Bridging the Gap, and we'll see you at the next episode.